The Neuropsychology of ADHD, and is the dopamine hypothesis satisfactory? When I began this project, I thought my focus would be the mesocortical dopamine pathway from the ventral tegmental area to the prefrontal cortex as it pertains to executive functioning capabilities, using ADHD as the mechanism for understanding how hypofunction affects it. Because I myself have ADHD, and it was always explained to me by both psychologists and the internet as a dopamine deficiency. That's why they prescribe medication for it that increases dopamine levels, thought I. So imagine my surprise when the first paper I read in my research, the dopamine hypothesis for ADHD, an evaluation of evidence accumulated from human studies and animal models by McDonald et al., was in fact a critique of the dopamine hypothesis rather than support. McDonald et al. Make several compelling arguments. Oh, I'm editing this while I do it. Oh god. Make several compelling arguments, and being that this monster of a paper was a meta-review of the last 40 years of ADHD research, including 227 references, well, it swayed me. But you all may be the judges. I'll simply share my journey of discovery. This presentation may not be a clear-cut example of how specific neuroscience leads to specific psychology, but at the very least, it is an example of how complicated the human nervous system is. So, let us begin at the beginning. What is ADHD? Why, it is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. The DSM-5 describes ADHD as a sort of spectrum of 3 categories: primarily inattentive, primarily hyperactive, and combined. But all ADHD brains have at least some degree of overlap of hyperactivity and inattentiveness. The categories are just a matter of how much, because when you're being diagnosed by that, they have a criteria, a little checklist, and if you meet a certain criteria of inattentive ones, you're primarily inattentive. Same for hyperactive, and combined, you meet that criteria if you meet the criteria for both. Boom, I remembered that. Okay, so what does all that mean? Well, in short, ADHD is an attentional disorder. In slightly longer, one symptom all ADHD brains share is a challenge in the higher order cognitive functions known as executive functioning in order to inhibit short-term impulses to pursue long-term goal-directed behavior. In even more longer, these executive functioning challenges include motor response inhibition, working memory, motivation control, reward-related decision-making, sustained attention, response variability, cognitive switching, temporal processing, time discrimination, and estimation tasks. In this humble author's anecdotal opinion from relentless introspection, the difference between the categories of ADHD are, again, my opinion here, differences in how the ADHD brain copes with the overstimulation they feel from the incessant bottom-up urges they are challenged to inhibit via top-down executive function. The hyperactive ADHD brain moves their body to find relief, whereas the inattentive ADHD brain moves their thoughts, with the combined category being somewhere in the middle. And I'll just throw in here to my my YouTube audience, the default mode network would be involved in that's almost what they're trying to inhibit a lot of the time. I didn't really talk about that in this paper, but there's so many things I didn't talk about in this paper that I wish I had more time and words to. But what about the brain? Tell us about the neuroscience, I hear you all asking. Okay, you guys asked for it. As it would turn out, the structural differences in an ADHD brain versus a neurotypical brain are legion. Quite literally, all four lobes of the cortex, the limbic system, the basal ganglia, the cerebellum, and the white matter connecting these things to the spine and many other things, all show abnormalities in ADHD brains versus neurotypical controls. What kind of abnormalities, you ask? Well, it's mostly more dense white matter connections than there should be. But, well, let's go down the list. In ADHD brains versus neurotypical controls, there have been found reduced global brain volume, reduced gray matter, which is neurons, in the frontostriatal circuit. And keep in mind, when they say frontostriatal circuit, they mean this. Look at all these things. I don't even think this is all of them. I think there's more things. Each of these things are, a little like organs almost, made up of cells or neurons, since they're nervous system cells. And then those regions are connected to other regions in these circuits, connected with white matter, mind you, which we'll get into right now. There's also been found atypical white matter, which is the neuronal connections between the neurons. In frontoparietal, frontolimbic, temporo-occipital, cerebellar, corona radiata. I feel like that should be coronal radiatal, but I'm not doing that. And internal capsule regions. Insert record scratch sound here. I'm not going to write here a bunch of times. Maybe I'll just say it like this in my real presentation. Oh, hold up, what does that mean? Well, that's what I asked myself when I read that. So I investigated deeper to see what they mean by atypical. Diffusion tensor imaging, DTI, is how they measured this atypicalness. DTI is a specialized MRI that measures the diffusion of water molecules in brain tissues to determine the structure of the nerve fibers, neuronal connections, or should have been a slash in between there, known as white matter. I tried to understand how this works, but they started talking about equations and covariance matrices of three-dimensional Gaussian distribution models and three orthogonal eigenvectors with eigenvalues, so I tapped out and just accepted that DTIs have two main metrics: fractional anisotropy and mean diffusivity. So fractional anisotropy, FA, measures the collinearity of axonal fibers and overall white matter integrity. The mean diffusivity, MD, measures local diffusivity, barriers to diffusion, which, since the DTI is like water diffusion through brain regions, measures the diffusion. I should stick to the script. Interpreting the atypicalness. So, the frontoparietal, frontolimbic, temporo-occipital, cerebellar, and corona radiata regions showed decreased FA, which is to say, non-linear neuronal connections. And see, I still wanted to understand better, so I found another study to explain FA even more to me, which said, FA is a highly sensitive measure for microstructural changes, however, not specific to the type of change. And is highly influenced by many crossings of fibers and alterations thereof, which I interpreted as this could mean less connections or less linear, more chaotic connections. That's where my money is going. Then, thankfully much more simply, the posterior limb of the internal capsule and the frontoparietal white matter showed lower MD. This one's easy to interpret because it just means the water had a hard time diffusing through the connective fibers in theory due to dense tissue structure, aka more connections. An interesting aside. Here I recalled autism spectrum disorder, ASD, also involves a hyperconnected brain. So, curious me, I looked it up, and ASD specifically shows similar results in these same two brain regions, with the same DTI scanning tech. I didn't keep looking to compare more ASD brain stuff because my paper is already long enough. But my primary source I mentioned earlier also notes the genes associated with ADHD are also associated with ASD. Okay, back to the interpreting of the atypicalness. Finally, the last interpretation. The frontolimbic white matter showed greater MD. I don't need that there. AKA, the water diffused more easily through the structures, implying less dense tissue barriers of neuronal connections. Which anecdotally makes sense to me since this is where the executive functioning capabilities of the frontal cortex would interact with the emotions of the limbic system, i.e., the core symptom of ADHD, exerting executive control over bottom-up impulses. And a picture break to give me a break to have a drink and to just show you guys, to help us all grasp how implicated the entire brain is in ADHD. This is, as it says, the frontoparietal circuit. All these little brain regions, individual brain regions, all communicating. And this is how much they're communicating. Yay, shapes. The frontolimbic circuit. Here we have 11 different brain regions. And as you can see, a significant portion of the brain all communicating. Limbic system and frontal cortex. And the temporo-occipital circuit. This is the worst picture of them all I found. There wasn't a good picture for this one, but you can still see all these little brain regions. This is the temporal lobe, and over here is the occipital lobe. And they make a circuit by communicating with each other. And this is something important about this. The corona radiata and the internal capsule. See, these are like the big tracts of nerve fibers, the white matter, connecting, up here, the cortex, the cortical regions, with the more midbrain regions, like the basal ganglia, which is there, and the limbic system a little below it, and then connecting that with the spine that regulates all the body's autonomic systems, the parasympathetic and sympathetic. And so the internal capsule and the corona radiata are both the ones that they also showed, like atypical white matter. From my interpretation, which I think is correct because my main source confirmed that ADHD does have hyperconnectivity, is there's more connections than normal, like in autism. And here be the cerebellum. That's this big guy on the back. But as you can see, this big guy on the back projects all these little paths out to like a large portion of the brain. And my primary source thinks the cerebellum has a big thing to do with ADHD, but I didn't have time or words to talk about it. So, but it also has atypical connections, more connections. The binding problem. So after reading this, getting to this point in my research, it occurred to me the nature of ADHD is reminiscent of the binding problem, which is the fact that we know which brain regions are involved in perception, and we know the psychological experience of perceiving, but there has not been found a single specific brain region that binds all the info together into our perception, like the sound and sight and smell and touch of something all together into perception. We just know each individual little region, similar in my opinion to ADHD. We see all these regions implicated, but how do they lead to the symptoms? Which brings us back to this, how science generally thinks or did think, and how the mainstream media and stuff has captured on to how it works, which is the dopamine hypothesis. Begone, title. MacDonald et al. Says the hypothesis, the dopamine hypothesis, is based on 4 premises. I hope I say what the actual dopamine hypothesis is below, otherwise I'll have to edit in. I'll say now the hypothesis is deficient dopamine levels. And it's based upon 4 premises. 1. The stimulant drugs used to treat ADHD target monoamine systems, particularly dopamine. 2. animal models genetically engineered for altered dopamine homeostasis mimic some symptoms of ADHD. 3. Brain imaging studies implicate the dopamine system. And 4. Studies of the genes in humans associated with ADHD implicate the dopamine system. Pretty convincing set of premises. I can see why it's the main hypothesis, or was. And what's more, to even further argue against myself, this is the dopamine pathways of the brain. And look at that, how much it covers, right? Like the ventral tegmental area where it starts and then goes. I'm definitely not making that noise when I present this to the class. But, it obviously it connects with the entire brain. So one can understand where the hypothesis came from. And without a doubt, dopamine is involved in ADHD. But my source presents compelling evidence to suggest it is not the explanation. Oh gosh, I didn't say actually what the hypothesis is. Let me just real quick. Sorry for anyone actually watching this. I gotta say specifically deficient levels of dopamine cause ADHD. Or maybe I didn't say that because there actually isn't a clear consensus. Yeah, whoops. Yeah, there isn't actually a clear consensus even in the literature of what the dopamine hypothesis is. I forgot. Sorry. Where am I? Yes, I said that. Okay. So now that compelling evidence I mentioned. The dopamine rebuttal. Stimulants. For example, the nature of ADHD medication. Stimulant medication, which increases dopamine levels. But pure dopamine agonists and antagonists, drugs that only interact with dopamine, have a limited effect treating ADHD, even less effective than drugs that only target the noradrenergic system, in fact. And interesting here, the stimulant drugs used to treat ADHD don't directly antagonize or agonize the dopamine receptors, but rather they block the reuptake of both dopamine and norepinephrine, thus increasing their availability at receptor sites, plus they increase synaptic dopamine release, plus they inhibit monoamine metabolism, plus they increase blood flow to the brain, all leading to reduced I do mention the DMN, kind of, yeah. All leading to reduced interference from the default mode network on the task-related brain networks, which is the major struggle of ADHD brains. These stimulants are effective at treating ADHD symptoms, but is this because they're fixing the root cause, or is it merely treating symptoms, like blowing air into a tire that keeps running out of air because there's a hole in it? A piece of evidence to consider is the fact that stimulant medication improves behavior and attention in neurotypical children too. My headphone just made a funny noise. Okay, it's still working. Searching, oh yeah, and now, the no consensus part of the rebuttal. Searching the keywords dopamine and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and ADHD yields just under 3,000 studies, with 39 meta-analyses across which there is no consensus on the nature of the dopamine hypothesis. Ha ha ha. This is why we edit. Some say dopamine plays a key role. Some say dopamine levels are too low in general. Some say they're just low in the prefrontal cortex. Some say they're too low all throughout the frontal striatal regions. Some say that dopamine metabolism or concentration of dopamine or even the signaling of dopamine is less than normal. But wait, there is more. One of the first studies suggesting lower extracellular dopamine in ADHD brains compared to healthy controls, wow, leave it, by Ernst et al., did in fact find less extracellular dopamine in the midbrain, though not in the striatum or frontal regions, which the authors reasoned was happening because of the extracellular dopamine being uptook too fast, like has been shown in the dorsal striatum of brains with Parkinson's disease. Now, while there have been studies supporting these findings, there have been other studies either failing to support or outright contradicting these hypodopaminergic findings, specifically finding no differences in the dopamine levels in striatal and midbrain regions between ADHD brains and healthy controls whatsoever. That one really needed an extra oomph at the end. Furthermore, I love this one. Ernst et al. Themselves found contradicting evidence to their own 1999 study in a study they did a year before, in 1998, where they found lower dopamine uptake, implying higher levels of extracellular dopamine in ADHD brains compared to healthy controls. And there is another handful of studies supporting those findings. My primary source gives a few thoughts as to how this contradictory data could be happening, such as low sample size, questionable validity, or most interestingly, dynamic versus generalized dopamine activity in the sense of decreased tonic, which is like long-term release of dopamine, versus increased phasic, short-term release of dopamine, found in a task-based study of ADHD brains. More recent reviews of the literature are leaning more to prefrontal hypoconnectivity. I'm going to have to check that after. I swear it was hyperconnectivity. No, it was hypo in the yeah, that's right. Prefrontal hypoconnectivity, less connectivity there, because that was the one that had the low MD between the frontal limbic that I was talking about at the beginning. Yes. And the rest was hyperconnected. Or prefrontal glucose hypometabolism being a cause as opposed to the dopamine hypothesis of past decades. But perhaps the best piece of evidence against the dopamine hypothesis as a clear-cut explanation for ADHD is comparing ADHD symptomology to a much more well-understood neuropsychological condition, which is well known to be a case of deficient levels of dopamine, Parkinson's disease, and thus I call this section the smoking gun of the dopamine rebuttal. Skadoosh. See, ADHD and Parkinson's disease both involve abnormalities in the frontostriatal circuit. But while it is hypothesized that deficient levels of dopamine, that's fine, cause ADHD, when it comes to PD, Parkinson's disease, I cannot just say PD, we know the root cause is a degeneration of dopaminergic neurons located in the substantia nigra pars compacta of the basal ganglia of the frontostriatal circuit. That makes me happy to read. So, what are the symptoms of Parkinson's disease? Surely they're similar to ADHD, if ADHD is, deficient dopamine levels. Well, Parkinson's disease is considered to be a motor disorder with symptoms including a pill-rolling tremor at rest, muscular rigidity, bradykinesia, which is slowness of movement, and often gait disturbance. Normally, motor control relies on dopaminergic input from the substantia nigra onto the basal ganglia, which is both inhibitory and excitatory. It's actually like a super complicated circuit if you look at the picture of it. But when the dopamine levels progressively lower, as in the case of Parkinson's disease, we see that motor control fail as that's not really above, is it? Aforementioned symptoms take place. Look at me forgetting my periods everywhere. So, very curious then how the dopamine hypothesis of ADHD suggests low dopamine levels cause motor hyperactivity. One would expect more Parkinson's disease-like symptoms to arise. Conclusion. I wish I had more words and time. There's so much more to dig into on this topic, but 'tis but a 2,000-word paper and a 20 to 30-minute presentation, so, though dopamine is surely implicated in the nature of ADHD, it certainly strikes me that ADHD is much more similar to the hyperconnected neuronal nature of autism spectrum disorder than to the dopamine deficient nature of Parkinson's disease. Thank you for listening to me talk. Finn. But not really Finn, because I have this page 2 after